Chapter 7. News spread far and wide through the systems of Shipmaster and her trade ship that had fought off a defected military raid ship and won. Rumors passed of her fearsome ship beast and the murderous rampage of retribution. It was said that the beast had not stopped until all that had harmed the crew lay dead. Rumors quickly turned to fame, and fame was quick to jump to legend as the story left one mouth and was retold by another. From trader to trader, port to port, until everything was lost upon countless retellings and translations. The word also spread of the bounty the shipmaster had collected as well, as the raid ship had been found responsible for the deaths of at least 7 ships and their crews. A pretty bounty, to be sure, but what was done with it was what brought fame to the shipmaster. Every credit had gone to the families of the dead as compensation. All 43 of them. Their families would grieve, but they would not be cast out onto the streets. Shipmaster Yatel went from being barely a trip away from permanent grounding to the captain of the most requested trade ship overnight. Her status was that of a warrior trader of old, reborn into the new era of commerce. At every new port, applicants fought tooth and nail for a chance to join the crew. Contracts flooded in like a dam had broken. Her ship had been repaired and outfitted in tokens of favor and generosity. To say she was unsure of what to do with it all was an understatement. She was downright overwhelmed. If the support hadn't been enough, though, the job offers were far more impressive. The most highly esteemed of the trade jobs and routes were along the fringes, close to the quarantine zone's ever-expanding border. The Union military funded work that could set an entire crew for retirement after only a few cycles. But the risks involved balanced that scale. Deserters and slavers moved in when the military moved out. The military would leave outposts, of course, and it was these that were crucial to the supply lines. But Union enforcement quickly faded when leaving those, as their manpower was beginning to spread thin. This had driven the need for deliveries to pass to civilian crews, and to pass some of the guarding of these routes to mercenaries. Mercenaries that would turn to piracy the moment their pay stopped. Fringe work was a dangerous business in between ports. Of her original crew, only 27 had survived, and of those, only 23 were fit for duty. She and her spawn, the medical crew, half of those on the bridge, and the engineers who had been in the good fortune of finding themselves in the right place at the right time. That place, of course, was behind the ship beast, her human, as he identified himself. Strangely enough, he seemed content to remain in the position as a guardian, a decision which was fine by her opinion, despite her unease with its mysterious origins. She knew the human was far more than capable at the job. He stood quietly at her side on the bridge, collar gleaming reflections of light and holograms before sealing to his flesh, as if his skin was simply metal for that chosen portion. The translator patches had sealed to his flesh and been similarly incorporated, but were no longer visible, as they sealed to the bone beneath his skin. He wore a simple garment that covered his waist and a portion of his lower legs, but that was all. He had said the ship was slightly too warm for him in clothing, and his metabolism was more than enough to prove this true, as he could put away more food than any 5 of the crew combined. A simple glance at the strange creature would not identify it as dangerous. Dense, perhaps, quite primal in form and appearance, but not inherently lethal. Yatel knew firsthand that this was deception. If the broken brace at her wrist wasn't proof enough, the weapon that hung on the wall next to the human would be. A bloody souvenir from the raiders' boarding. During their first landing after the military escort, she had sent the human to guard her spawn and several of the accompanying crew members as they went on shore leave. It was customary to have crews let off to spend some of their hard-earned credits, but she had not expected them to all spend a majority of those on a single purchase. A long, 2-handed blade. It had been put together with the metal from 2 of the blades left behind after the attack. Obviously, the design had been drawn up for a military mechanized unit. It was thread-woven with some of the same material that made up her outer hull, dense interwoven metallic sheets that had been molded together under intense pressure and steered into shape by electromagnetic pulses. dense with mass that would throw any of her crew off balance no matter how much they dropped the gravity on the ship. The weapon had seemed graceful in the human's hands. It had a single edge, dropping away from a crossguard. Dangerously sharp, the edge ran down a straight and curved up slightly at the end. The last portion of the back length was also edged, creating a fearsome curved tip. It seemed to beg for combat. Sonat and Saiza had also purchased weapons with their pay, as had most of the crew, likely with their savings from previous trips considering the price of the military-issued equipment gleaming on the wall. All of them now wore light pistols, each with 10 rounds of the ammunition. Her crew had seen enough of their blood spilled, and their stares, when not occupied by the task at hand, brought Yatal chills. They mourned as their species traditionally did, in silence. Their race had no official title, at least not among themselves. Their own titles and status sufficed, and when that did not, their language simply seemed to go around the subject by simply using a word that translated roughly to others like themselves. Other species didn't bother with that cultural aspect. By others, their race was known as sirens, for their voices were melodies few species seemed to find they could stomach without a biosync to intervene. Thought to be one of the first of the known spacefaring peoples, the home planets of their ancestors had long since been all but abandoned for the stars. Over generations, change in culture and values had molded into something almost nomadic, if there was such a thing on the galactic scale. Trade and exploration were regarded as being above all other aspirations for the long-lived species. To be part of a successful ship was regarded as a rank of status and class. Few of their kind was capable of any extended stay upon solid ground, though a select few had been known to take to planets with oceans in their retirement, the waves and endless horizons a suitable replacement for the stars above. A cracking sound brought her attention once again to the human. It had a strange mannerism, in which it would twist its joints to such pressure that audible pops of pressure were released. It certainly seemed to put the newer members of the crew on edge, but she had come to the impression that he did it specifically to annoy her. A trait she actually found reassuring, as it encouraged her to believe it was not simply intellect and killing potential. She and her guardian had reached their agreement behind closed doors. He would remain under the guise of a ship guardian, and he would follow her commands. In return for this, she would assist him in finding if his people still existed. He would have no better chances than to be on a trade vessel traveling to every known corner of the galaxy, and Yatal's ship and crew would be well protected. It was a dedicated and respectable goal, and should anything happen to her, the human had agreed to stay by her spawn. Her spawn and Dehair, more specifically. Yatal was yet to understand it entirely, but she had come to the belief that bonding the human into her service and loyalty involved far more than agreements and contracts. It had been fierce on the point of the medical officer, and could be seen following her as often as Yatal or her spawn. Her new crew members had been treating Dehair as more than just a senior crew member because of it, and instead as someone of status. Mostly this was due to a misunderstanding that none of the veterans seemed to be willing to address. The new crew seemed to think the human was just a mildly intelligent beast that was extremely well trained. From an outside view, this could seem to be the case. The collar was fully fused to its neck, and its mannerisms were not entirely understandable without having been in its company for extended periods of time. It also didn't help matters that the human, much to her amusement, did not correct the misunderstanding any more than the veterans. Its biosync was fully integrated into its thick dermal layer, leaving no visible trace, which allowed it to do as it pleased while quietly observing. To her knowledge, it only spoke to those who knew it could, and only when necessary. Yatal would have intervened with this had it not been for the fact that the misunderstanding offered a real benefit. The hiring process was something of a mixed bag, and some of the new talent had snuck in on ambition alone. And that was a danger all in and of itself, and many had been weeded out and left at the next port to be replaced by a more experienced counterpart. A trade vessel on the edges of the galactic frontier was no place for new blood to try their hand. That was what the inner systems were for. Considering the contracts she had accepted, there was no time for training fresh blood. The silent guardian would continue tipping her off on any transgressions within her crew, and she would continue to pretend that it was simply a beast. The military outpost wasn't the prettiest thing, but as far as importance went, it held its own over a long list of rivals. On a planet in one of the outermost systems near the containment line, the facility was simply a ground base with a space elevator tethered to it. Outside of its fixed orbit station, which was state-of-the-art, the outpost itself was a relic. A relic with a warp port. Warp ports were hard to manage and maintain, but they were even more difficult to establish in the first place. A lot of trial and error involved with that process, and Zyos didn't like to think about the first poor souls drafted for the test runs. It was sadistically comical in its own strange way. The stations were essentially giant orbiting nets, made to catch incoming warp spheres. Primitive as it got, but considering the unpredictable nature of the task, they functioned well. 99.94% of jumps were caught. The other 0.06% had a different fate. Acceptable losses is what the military classified those as. He classified those as better them than him. His synthetic body was bipedal this time. For some reason, he preferred these bodies to those that crawled on multiple limbs, or any of the other varieties. He had tried them all by now, and settled on simplicity. Many of those structures were overcomplicated, and having less to worry about made things easier for Zyos to focus. He needed that focus. Acting as a living parcel, he delivered his information by memory alone, and had reported to several different messengers, who in turn reported directly to High Command by means of FTL transit. It had been sheer coincidence he had glanced up to check the holomonitor at the terminal. Reports of Shipmaster and Shipbeast have become famous overnight here in Sector 7, as they apparently were boarded by a defected platoon of shock troopers turned pirates. Our initial reports show that every pirate was killed before the initial military task force could reach their distress signal. Total body count is over 50, not including crew casualties. The reporter paused for dramatic effect, and Zyos felt a wave of curiosity. A trade vessel, fighting off military-trained board and breach troopers. Shouldn't be possible, not without massive firepower. Zyos waited to hear about the fluke of luck. Perhaps they had been carrying military weaponry as cargo and armed the crew in time to repel. Or perhaps they had seen the attack coming and pulled some hard maneuvers leading to the pirate ship crashing. To his amazement, he found nothing of the sort. The ship beast had simply gone on a killing spree for the records. Unbelievable. He stood there for a good portion of the rotation as he watched the same report over and over again, waiting for more information. The best he received for his wait was a simple videocast of the surviving crew walking off at the next port. Their ship had limped in, to say the very least, and the visible damage was tremendous. A single red stripe of patchwork had been sealed over the bridge. As he waited, he felt his patience slipping, and a grinding feeling on his molded nerves itch at him. Then he saw it. Directly before the video cut out, he saw a quick clip of the siren in the scaled cloak, and standing next to it, the ship beast. It was just a snippet, barely enough time for him to lock the image into memory, but it had been there. The primal creature that had made history. He had to speak to the shipmaster. If she was willing to sell the beast... No, she wouldn't. The creature was priceless now. A bona fide killing machine like that didn't get sold to the highest bidder. Something like that was kept close at hand. Still, there was a chance she might be able to provide him the knowledge of where to find another. He searched his vast memory, but could find nothing that matched. This species was new to him. And considering he had traveled to every corner of the inhabited galaxy, that was saying quite a bit. Finally, here was something worth chasing, a goal to seek. The fringes were a wonderful place indeed. Chikarob was still amazed at his surroundings, and he had been on board the trade ship for over 20 rotations now. A simple Oxata like himself working on a siren trade vessel, it was almost unbelievable. Most crews had some such variety, but it was widely known and respected that the most elite crews were those with a siren shipmaster with recognition from the Trade Guild, and siren shipmasters were notoriously picky about other species on board their vessels. A song-like melody buzzed into understandable tones through his biolink as he brought himself to stand at attention. His scales shifted color from a murky portrayal of his surroundings to a solid green as he consciously willed his natural camouflage under his control. Other new crew members stood in similar fashion. A few were siren, but the others were of different species. He knew the closest of which was Arula, and had quickly attempted to stay out of its way when he realized it was not the friendly merchant type he was used to on the surface. Its body had one set of upper limbs which bore markings of military service, and below its slender torso lay two sets of lower limbs which joined the muscular body in a sleek manner and gave it a streamlined appearance. Each of the limbs ended in a 3-digit claw that clacked and clicked on the metal floor of the ship as it shifted positions. To the far side of the room, Chikrobe could see 2 other new recruits, which were unfamiliar to him. Like the Rula, they too bore tattoos showing military service on their bodies, but their bodies themselves were covered in spike carapace. It resembled armor, and likely had the same effect. Their 3 sets of upper limbs seemed to end in overlapping clamp-like fashion, while their lower 3 sets of limbs seemed to be set at strange angles. Their movement gave off the impression of scuttling. Turning his attention back over to his deep green scales, he inspected himself to be certain he was presentable. Like most Oxot, he was strong, at least strong when physically compared to most species in the Union, but Chikrobe had never trained in combat. Many of his fellow hatchlings had gone out and joined rank with military units, but Chikrobe had found his calling as an engineer. To join a successful ship had always been his goal, and he had slowly worked his way up with a series of difficult jobs, starting as a simple orbital technician planetside and going up from there. He had worked on ships in station docking for 7 cycles before getting this opportunity. But he was beginning to wonder if he had bit off more than he could chew. This was fringe work, after all. As you should all know by now, Shipmaster Yatal has obtained contracts with the Union military along the 89th section. We will be joining up with a convoy of ships along the tradeway and unloading cargo at the outposts as we travel. We will then receive payment and instructions for a second contract. Their assigned senior crew member had arrived and begun their briefing for the rotation. I know many of you have grown rather impatient with the long stay at the previous port, but we had to be certain all new members of the crew were suitable. That was certainly true. The interview process itself had stressed Chikrobe past the point of his color control and had been done in person by the shipmaster. The entire time he had been answering her questions and providing explanation, that ship beast had been slowly circling. It was docile in appearance, but that pacing reminded Chikrobe too much of a predatory beast. The thing he remembered the most was the sound of its strange feet. Oxot had surprisingly good hearing for a species that had no outer ears. They relied heavily on detecting vibrations through the scales on the bottom of their feet, which had evolved on the plains of their homeworld. When there was no true cover for miles, blending in with the scenery and feeling motion from miles away had been true necessity, but for some reason the ship beast seemed to walk almost imperceptibly. Unlike most species, the creature seemed to have an almost triple touching step. It slipped lightly from its toes to a rounded section to the heel in a graceful sequence of bipedal motion. That was the grace of a hunter, and it reminded Chikrobe greatly of the death beasts that had preyed upon his species for thousands of years before Oxot had banded together in intelligent society and taken control of their homeworld. He recalled visiting a museum once while in a Center-World station. In it, there were detailed studies and displays for public view on creatures long brought to extinction on any planet within the Union's reach. Creatures that had been too strong and primal to be truly tamed and deemed a threat to intelligent life. The ship beast seemed to scream a silent threat as it moved that made Chikrobe almost doubt the sealed collar on its neck. Where had the shipmaster found such a creature he dared not imagine. He had not been surprised to learn it came from a high-gravity environment, but he had been surprised to learn how much power the shipmaster dedicated to the beast's pen to replicate it. Generally, a ship engine was in unlimited use. As long as output was minimal, it would persist for at least 200 full cycles before needing replacement. The shipmaster was going to be lucky if theirs lasted 15 at the rate it was in use. All ships had the function built in for gravity focus shifts, especially if certain cargo had specific conditions to be met. Generally, though, even the hardiest of crews would never hold the gravity in any section of the ship for more than 50% over the standard galactic gravity constant. Despite this, for some reason unknown to Chukrobe, the Beast Pen, which was a large open storage unit near the medical bay, was held at well over twice the normal gravity on the ship. This was not part-time either. This was constant, even when at port. Most of the crew would only be able to survive in an environment like that for a maximum of 3 rotations before they were simply incapable of breathing, and it had almost killed one of the previous recruits who had walked in unknowingly while performing a routine check of the ship maintenance panels. The poor recruit's equipment had brought him to the floor and held him there until he was discovered by his shift replacement a rotation later. The ship beast slept there, and occasionally stayed there for extended periods of time without issue. Yes, that creature gave Chukrobe a very uneasy feeling. Just thinking about the thing gave a sensation of scales being abraded. This rotation we will be performing the routine checks on the life support system and likely be providing maintenance for a few exosuits in the hangar bay. A soft voice lifted through the cabin as it listed the shift instructions and drew Chukrobe's wondering thoughts back to the briefing. Their senior went by the name of Dehair, and was honestly not very impressive or distinguished in Chukrobe's opinion. To her credit, though, she had managed to survive an encounter with one of the most notorious pirate ships in recent memory. Her white suit seemed in sharp contrast to their black and gray uniforms, and it marked her as a medical officer. This was unusual, but it seemed to fit with the trend of unusual things on the ship. For the engineering unit to have a senior medical officer as their commanding unit spoke lengths to the damage suffered by the previous trade route. At first, this had been treated with displeasure by the new recruits, as they obviously expected some warlike menace and impressive physical stature. How else would one expect an engineer on a trade vessel along the fringes? Apparently, and much to everyone's surprise, Dehair had held the role as an engineer in a previous contract. Although she did not have a warlike appearance or much in the way of physical stature, she did provide excellent instruction on the subtle nuances of the ship. Chukrobe's respect for the siren had increased slightly over time. He seemed to be alone in that regard. For some species, appearances were everything. The Rula spoke in a fierce tongue, and their translators were unable to mask it entirely. I still do not see why we are not trusted to work without the guidance of an officer outside our trade. It snorted roughly as it cocked its sleek head to the left in a sign of displeasure. We should not be forced to obey a member of the crew who is not the shipmaster, especially not one who has not earned our respect. Any who had ever encountered a Rula would know that they were a proud species. Proud and rather violently stubborn as well. Merchants, traders, scientists, and warriors. Once their respect was earned, they were loyal. That was the tough part, though, earning its respect. As fellow crew and as soldiers, they were held in high regard, being a perfect mix of intelligence and ferocity. For anyone else, they were simply difficult. Sometimes they were difficult and dangerous. Considering Rula were omnivores, that often put dangerous into a different light. Their tiny siren crew leader stared up at the larger alien, with pure green eyes calm and her long, slender tail shifting in a slow, lazy whip. Agitation was clear, but not unease. The Rula towered over her, easily another half her height and maybe 3 times her mass. The slow clicking of its claws seemed to ring through the scales on Chukrobe's feet like tiny tremors. The crew watching this gave off an almost palpable sense of displeasure. This scenario was not something any of them wanted to become involved in. On the far side of the room, there was slight movement toward the Rula by the 2 shelled aliens. Perhaps they thought some shared background might warrant enough respect to encourage the Rula to back down. A cracking hit flew from one of the Rula's clawed limbs to throw the closest one on its back, without so much as a glance in their direction. The other froze in place, not prepared to scuttle closer. I will take orders from the shipmaster Yutail. I have seen her scars, and she has my respect. You, though, you have done nothing. I do not agree with this. The Rula reared up on its backmost limbs, presenting an impressive display of height and danger. All of its claws angled in a formidable array as it balanced, before slamming down upon the hull to bring its face directly level with the sirens. Her long mane of hair rustled back with the long exhalation that followed. She did not blink. It was then Chakrobe made to step forward and try to stop what was likely going to occur. Dehair was about to be gravely injured if she did not break that challenging gaze. The medical officer was directly meeting Arula's cultural behavior to consent for a duel, regardless of whether she realized it. Barely 2 steps towards the confrontation, and his scales shivered. That abrasive feeling grated up his spine as rough motion was felt through the floor. He turned to see the beast had entered the room and was staring down the Rula. It was time to get out of the way. The Rula turned its sleek form away from Dehair and faced the ship beast instead, its slit nostrils flaring as it assessed the creature. The beast met its gaze and glided along with that casual grace, each step taking it barely any visible effort until the two were face to face. Height-wise, the Rula stood a unit above the human, but only because it had reared up on its back legs. The human seemed unconcerned by the pose and held the gaze with those strange eyes. The long scar on its back caught the light in the room in an eerie fashion as it stood completely motionless. The other lesser scars seemed to catch in similar fashion as the beast straightened its posture. Aside from the tattoo of military service, the Rula bore only a few scars, and none of any great size. When tallied in comparison to the creature that stood before it, the difference seemed to shout at all who had eyes. This would not end in the Rula's favor. Slowly the Rula lowered itself back to the ground. The staring continued, but the intensity of the situation had passed. It blinked once, and the ship beast did the same, before abruptly turning and leaving the room as quickly as it had arrived. Chakrobe could swear one of his hearts had stopped beating during that confrontation, and the Rula looked equally spooked. Where in all the void had Shipmaster Yatel found that thing?